Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston.
We're your hosts and real-life sisters who binge on historical drama.
We'll talk about films, fictional adaptations, and dramatic series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
So fill your teacup or mug with your favorite sip as we explore what's fact, what's fiction, and the so what on historical drama with the Boston Sisters. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical films and dramatic series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. Listen to past episodes and sign up for our newsletter on our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters to stay up to date on new episodes and bonus content. It's been 50 years since the release of the 1974 film adaptation of F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby. Directed by Jack Clayton and featuring Robert Redford as Jay Gatsby, Mia Farrow as Daisy Buchanan, and Sam Waterston as Nick Carraway, the film is a window into the roaring 1920s of the Jazz Age, as Fitzgerald is credited for coining the phrase. The story is also a mirror on American social constructs for wealth, class, and illusion, as well as the destructive power to recapture the past. Highlighting the 50th anniversary of the 1974 version of The Great Gatsby is another opportunity to talk with author and professor of English Emily Bernard about this 1920s novel adapted for film and the themes that continue to resonate with our own times. Our conversation with Emily about the film adaptation of Nella Larsen's 1929 novel Passing in episode 2 of the podcast remains one of our most popular listens. We'll tell you more about Emily in a moment.
F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby, has been adapted multiple times for the big screen. In 1926 as a silent film, 1949 during Hollywood's Golden Age, the 1974 version we're highlighting in this podcast, a 2002 version titled G, Bringing Hip Hop to the Hamptons, and the 2013 film by Baz Luhrmann. This timeless story has unfolded on television, stage, opera, dance, radio dramas, and a Broadway musical debut in 2024. The Great Gatsby is a poignant commentary on social climbing, the illusion of wealth, and the destructive nature of the American dream. In the 1974 film, director Jack Clayton paints a vivid picture of the era, capturing the frenetic energy of jazz music from the 1920s with score by band leader Nelson Riddle. And costume designer Leonie V. Aldridge brings in extravagant fashion from cool pastels to electric flapper attire, masking the moral ambiguity lurking beneath the surface.
You didn't want me when you had me.
The Great Gatsby cast includes Robert Redford, who portrays Jay Gatsby, a man with enormous wealth and a mysterious past who yearns for a love long out of reach. Mia Farrow embodies the captivating Daisy Buchanan, torn between societal expectations and a past forbidden passion. Sam Waterston, whom many know from the TV series Law and Order, is Nick Carraway, Daisy's cousin, who is also guide and narrator of this opulent world. Nick has come to New York City from the Midwest to seek his fortune in bond sales. He spends this fateful summer in a cottage on the New Money West Egg side of Long Island, as written in the book, and befriends his next-door neighbor, Jay Gatsby. Bruce Stern is Daisy's East Egg, old money, wealthy, arrogant, philandering husband, Tom Buchanan, who attended Yale with Nick. Tom's mistress, Myrtle Wilson, played by Karen Black, dreams of leaving the Queen's Valley of the Ashes with Tom and ending her disappointing marriage to George Wilson, an owner of a gas station and garage, who's played by Scott Wilson. Lois Childs, who also starred in The Way We Were with Robert Redford, listen to our past episode for the 50th anniversary of that film, is Jordan Baker, an independent yet aloof single woman and golf pro. Jordan is the modern flapper, but her honesty handicap remains uncalculated. The screenplay for The Great Gatsby was written by Francis Ford Coppola of The Godfather fame. Though the 1974 film received mixed critical reactions, The Great Gatsby received 2 Academy Awards for Best Music by Nelson Riddle and Best Costume Design by Theone Aldridge. The 1974 adaptation of The Great Gatsby is available for streaming with a subscription or fee. Do a search to find out which streaming services offer The Great Gatsby. Also, check your local library.
We now introduce our guest, Emily Bernard. Emily Bernard is the author of Black is the Body, Stories from My Grandmother's Time, My Mother's Time, and Mine, which was named one of the best books of 2019 by Kirkus Reviews and National Public Radio. Emily is the winner of the 2020 Los Angeles Times Christopher Isherwood Prize for Autobiographical Prose. Her previous works include Remember Me to Harlem, The Letters of Langston Hughes and Carl Van Vechten, which was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and Some of My Best Friends, Writings on Interracial Friendship, which was chosen by the New York Public Library as a book for the teenage. Her essays have been reprinted in Best American Essays, Best African American Essays, and Best of Creative Nonfiction. A 2020 Andrew Carnegie Fellow, Emily is the Julian Lindsay Green and Gold Professor of English at the University of Vermont.
Well, Emily, welcome back to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
It is so wonderful to be back. Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this for so long.
And I should say, welcome back to a 1920s conversation.
Yes.
Yet again, we've said that this is our favorite time period, and we're learning more and more about it. It was not just a flapper time.
Nope, it was not. So much was happening.
So much
cultural
was happening.
Revolution.
Definitely. Let's talk about the novel. Start off with F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby. When were you introduced to this novel? Where were you then? And what were your personal reactions to Fitzgerald's novel at that time?
Well, I must confess that I was a fan when I read the novel. I think I read it in high school, like probably many of us. And as my daughters read it in high school too, they hated it, by the way.
Why?
They thought that, you know, it's interesting. My daughter, we went out today and I was asking her about it. She said she loved ragtime. And I think all the things that were written out, let's say, or left out of The Great Gatsby, the subtle implications around race and, you know, religion and ethnicity, class, the ragtime worked for her as a bigger landscape. It's more pronounced. And in that way, I think the more modern adaptation of the novel worked for her. But when I read it, you know, it was a different moment. You know, I mean, I think this new production works because it is such a reflection of a new moment. And I read it at a moment when I could feel, I think, the novel's own empathy, the novel's empathy for the character of Jay Gatsby. So when I watched the more modern version, I understood what my daughters identified. It felt to me like a perfect indication of the different cultural impulses that we're separately captured by. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think they really represent the eras beautifully.
So the whole reinterpretation for another generation. Yeah.
It worked, I think. But I loved it. And I loved it because it was, it reflected the subtle tensions and anxieties of a period that I had come to love, which is, you know, the Jazz Age more broadly. And then of course the Harlem Renaissance more specifically. I saw enough echoes, I think, in the novel that made me understand what the book was trying to capture. And I liked it. I liked the prose. It appealed to me at the time, but I think, I understand why it failed to capture my daughter's heart in the same way.
Yeah, yeah. Do you teach this novel in your classes? And if you do, what are the themes that seem to come up and that resonate with the students that you're teaching?
I haven't had occasion to teach the novel in my classes. I teach, when I teach classes on the Jazz Age, there's so much to talk about the Harlem Renaissance that it hasn't been explored. I end up running out of time. But of course, I also bet on my students having read the book in high school, so I can make allusions. I can make allusions to the book. But I haven't taught it on the college level. So, it was interesting to revisit it because it's been many years since I revisited it, and when I read it again, I read it with the heart of that high school student who was living in Nashville, Tennessee, and excited, maybe like Jay Gatsby, about, this bigger world that was somehow outside of my very provincial world, in Nashville, New York, and so I could see it from that vantage point. It still, I think, appeals to me on that level. But of course, certainly, I mean, looking at it again, and then what the movie tries to revive, it made me remember, all of the things that about it that, still make sense to me as both a scholar and, a dreamer.
Yeah, I remember reading the book, and I think as someone who aspired to become a writer, I was just so drawn to the writing first. And then the story. I think the film helped me understand the story just as a basic story with the story arcs. And then reading the book again, the symbolism came through. And one of the things I always felt was that The Great Gatsby was not a love story. I think a lot of people want to see it as, love unfulfilled, or what do they call it?
Unrequited love.
Yeah, that kind of
The
story.
star-crossed lovers.
Yeah. But what does this 1974 version tell us about American culture and society and the meaning of friendship, which I think is interesting in the story, marriage, of course, and genuine love?
Yeah, these are really, I mean, and it's wonderful. You see, why it has survived. That was the thing that was really, thank you for that, opportunity that you gave me to revisit it, because it makes sense why it still captures us. Because I think not only does it speak so directly to all of the things I know we're going to get into in this discussion, but it allows for that romantic view. And I think that's really, the literature that survives is capacious enough to communicate deep universal truths, I think, about who we are as human beings, but also to hide from us the things that we're not willing to see. And I think you're right. The novel, it's ironic the way the novel has survived as a story of romance when it really isn't at all about that. If anything, I think it's such an indictment of consumer culture. And you have Daisy Buchanan, who is, like the economy now, she is there on the billboards in Times Square, this kind of waif-like blonde, creature, but she's unable to make a choice. And in some ways, the movie is an argument, or the book is an argument about why women should, not have rights because they can't make choices, And so, I mean, she can't make a choice. And that's what capitalism is about. It's about the kind of, the kind of bounty of choices we have. And here's a figure who has everything, as they used to say in that era, free, white, and 21. But she can't make a choice between two men. They try to make a choice for her, manipulate her, and she ends up being locked into a decision because of, a crime that she is unable to really take account.
Own up to?
To own up to, exactly. I mean, that's why it forces her, that's what makes this decision for her. It's not at all romantic. And if anything, it shows the hollowness of these, of the Gilded Age, if you will, and not the Gilded Age, but, all of the ways that the varnish continues to shine in New York. and its outer regions. I was thinking about the boys, in the film, the 1974 version, who spray paint the curse word,
Yeah. That
But
was
I was
so
thinking,
valid when it was on television.
yeah. But I was thinking, they're right. I mean, they're right. This is all hollow. It's made of nothing. These people have no real sense of allegiance to each other. It's a tragedy, but it's a tragedy that is linked, inextricably linked to the promise of American freedom. That is what it means, Mr. Nobody from Nowhere. I thought, I loved how that phrase is repeated, of course, the novel and then both, the adaptations. But I thought, isn't that the promise, the mystery of what it means to live in America, to migrate to the city, that you can shed the past, but that becomes the thing that, keeps Gatsby kind of locked in place, his inability to actually shed the past. And so it's really, I think, an indictment of the lie that is kind of freedom in this country. We are all tied to something, to our past. You can't escape it. And it does, of course, catch up to everybody in the book.
Yeah. It's interesting when you're talking about capitalism, and in our own time, we have even more choices, and we talk about the anxiety that produces. But the thing about the hollowness, interestingly, when I rewatched the film, I was also taking an online course that the Smithsonian offered on visual literacy. And there was this one section in the course where the lecturer talked about a period, I think it was in 17th century Dutch painting or Flemish painting, of still lifes, where the symbolism was about the impermanence of life and the hollowness of materialism. And the period was called, the style was called vanitas, which I thought, oh my God, that's like the opening in the 1974 Gatsby. We see his car, we see the beautiful mansion, the swimming pool, the grand ballroom with the piano, all of his monogrammed grooming materials, and brushes. And then there's this half-eaten sandwich that a fly is crawling across. And it just struck me that the director really captured kind of this sense of, despite all the flashes, something decayed underneath. So, in the novel, what in American society that wasn't quite as flashy as the surface was Fitzgerald trying to convey through the novel, that I think the film got at as well?
I love that. I love your reference to that sandwich. It makes me think, I must say, immediately in the end, when Gatsby's father, Mr. Gatz, comes to claim him. And in the 1974 version, it was a time, actually the only moment in the film where my heart really caught, when he's holding that sandwich with both hands. And it made me reflect on how little eating there had been in the book. So much drinking, so little eating. Something my Italian husband always notices, who's eating what, And I thought, there's these people who are rail thin, and women are now kind of, who have, white women, let's say, upper middle class, striving white women, have adopted a model of the female form, right? That is about being a pre-adolescent boy, frankly. So it's all about denial of desire, of the body, of all the kind of glandular pleasures. And here comes the father, and it's the only moment of nourishment, of someone feeding someone else. Even though, you have a mother and child in the book, and we still have a sense of people really belonging to each other, and a sense of deep, visceral obligation and connection to each other. So I think that's what, is missing, really. The idea that a freedom from, I was thinking about the idea, Norman Rockwell's 4 freedoms, and the freedom to and the freedom from. And so there are 2 different kinds of questions, right? Or conditions, the freedom from, a freedom from my past, a freedom from, the stigma of, my ethnicity, my race, my gender, my sexuality. Okay. So that's all a kind of a negative, that's what I'm rejecting. That's what I'm escaping. But the freedom to do what? It's as if these people haven't created a positive, affirmative moral identity. It's all about negativity. What I will deny, what I will erase, what I will ignore. what I'm fighting. But what then is the affirmative identity? What is it? If you know what you don't, who you're not, what you're running from, then who are you and where can you rest? But they can never rest. It's a zero sum game in this world that both Gatsby and both directors create. It's just about power. And I only have power because someone else doesn't have power. I'm only white because this person isn't, and you have these white male characters who are obsessed with their own obsolescence,
Yeah.
and it's a kind of, and they're the most masculine characters who feel the threat to their masculinity. They feel already emasculated by the growth of the Negro race in this case at Lothrop Stoddard, what he stands for. So they feel there's an embattled masculinity. So if you're always embattled and you're always running from and you're always denying and negating and defending, what time does that leave you to create an affirmative relationship with anyone else? If your whole life is about defending yourself from your actual identity and protecting secrets, then you don't have time maybe to plant a garden, to make a meal, to say, I love you to someone, to make yourself vulnerable, frankly, to another person, and to admit your connectedness with other human beings. You're so focused on your isolated identity. And I think, it's sad. I was thinking about Nick Gatsby as a narcissistic character. That's such now the thing people are talking about, what it means, narcissism. And I was thinking the way that he needs to force Daisy in both all iterations, in both, in the book, but also in Robert Redford's iteration and then Leo DiCaprio's iteration. You not only must admit your love for me, but admit that you never loved your husband. It's like, isn't that narcissism? It's sort of, you keep somebody in perpetual present. They're never allowed to grow or to change, right? Isn't that what the critique of the narcissist is, that they're imprisoned in their own fantasy world that doesn't admit anyone else's reality. So I thought about that. I thought, God, Gatsby really is a narcissist.
Yeah.
I thought Leo DiCaprio played him to great effect and almost diabolically, whereas Robert Redford was much more, kind of genteel and maybe covert narcissist. But, that's the problem, I think, I would say, in the story, is that the landscape, the world only allows for the singular I. It doesn't allow for community. It doesn't allow for, because community needs vulnerability, we need to admit that we belong to each other and that we need each other. But that's impossible in this world, where it's all a kind of game of keep away. I give you so much information, but I keep so much information, and the power is sort of locked somewhere in that balance.
Wow.
I just want to say for our listeners, we all saw both versions, the 1974 version of The Great Gatsby and the Baz Luhrmann version with Leonardo DiCaprio. So just as a reference, if we mentioned Leonardo, you'll know why. Speaking of identity, one thing that people seem to want to claim as part of their identity is place. And there's a lot of conversation about where people are from. And, we get that question in our lives. So, where are you from? Where are you from? And Tequina and I live in Washington, D.C. And when we say we were born here, we lived here all our lives, people are like, really? I've never met someone like that. Because the city has this reputation for being
transient.
Yeah, transient.
I see.
So, okay, that's enough of us. But back to Gatsby. Tom, we know, is from Chicago. We know that. He owns up to it. Daisy is from Louisville, Kentucky. Gatsby and Nick are from the Midwest. Where specifically? Maybe we know, don't know. And the East Coast, or New York, seems to be represented in this story as some kind of corrupting influence for these characters. Whereas we know the history, and when you talk about the Harlem Renaissance, New York was the destination for freedom and opportunity for African Americans. Talk about the significance of place and regional identity in this story.
It's fascinating. It's to be thinking about what like what New York represented, I can't help it. My mind goes immediately to Langston Hughes' 1940 autobiography, The Big C. And he has a great scene where he emerges from the subway, 125th Street in New York. And he's, here I am, he's come to go to Columbia and New York, and all the exclamation points. It's you feel it, his excitement as a young man. And he's writing this from the vantage point, it's 1940 when he writes the book, and he's been famous for many years. So, it's coming for him. Can't help but caught up in the excitement and the promise that actually, New York makes good on its promise to someone like Langston Hughes, not so good on its promise for the scores of others, maybe anonymous, untalented souls, or even talented souls. But for Hughes, it was what it seemed to be, the city of dreams. I mean, from Langston Hughes to Jay-Z's, song about New York. And I thought Jay-Z was a wonderful kind of narrator or bard, what a perfect choice for the more modern, the 2013 adaptation.
Yeah, Baz Luhrmann.
Yeah, I thought he was a great kind of bard. I mean, really, honestly, I thought the 2013 was like almost a musical, in the way that the music attended to the city. But, for someone like Gatsby, it's a place to belong, but it's also a place that affords him escape. And so it has a kind of, it's cloaked. It allows him to cloak it allows him to cloak himself in the kind of mystery he needs. But he's just only a half step ahead of the game all the time. He's just another drifter who's landed in this place and enabled himself to invent himself, using his whiteness, using all the instruments of passing. And in all, I think, iterations, his kind of conventional American, if you will, good looks, to play a role or let people assume it's at the end of the autobiography of an ex-colored man. He says, I'm not going to affirm a black identity, nor will I deny a white identity. I will let the world take me as it will. And that's what Gatsby's able to do in New York. It's a city of, as you say, it's a transient city like DC, right? That's what's exciting about it, that you can invent yourself. But I think that the hidden, cost that we don't maybe think about enough is what you have to leave behind, what it forces you to leave behind. And of course, again, to great effect in the 1974 version, when Mr. Gatz comes to claim his son's body, and he has a story to tell, and a story is big enough to accommodate his son's abandonment. He says, well, this is what New York requires. This is what this life in the city requires. It requires to become great. Yeah. He sees himself as collateral damage. His own father is it's just something beautifully tragic about that. But also, he's one of the humane voices, trying to understand this larger story. Why did my son abandon me? Because he had the potential to help the country repair itself. So that idea of sacrifice, one sacrifice, one's identity, one's home, one's parents to serve this larger ideal. But to what end? We know that wasn't really what Gatsby was after. He was after a woman who he didn't even really know. She was just another ornament to him, another shiny thing like his yellow car. This, or not, that get Daisy's car, but these roadsters that they all, and his grand piano. She's just another instrument to him, and to help him escape. So, one has to ask, what is New York really for this character? One thing I loved about the modern version is that it really exposes the things that Fitzgerald suggests. It really pronounces those things. That's Fitzgerald kind of whispers in the book, and race is really tied to it. The vitality of the city. When Nick in that opening monologue, and they're very, they're nice mirrors in the 1974 version and the 2013 version. And Nick is kind of pontificating, out loud for us. And he's saying that nothing new was being made, but then in the 2013 version, we have the blast of hip hop. So here's, kind of here's Nick, lamenting, this loss of creativity and innovation as people were turning toward the consumer culture and off the rack, narcotics to soothe their, existential woes. But the blast of hip hop is Black innovation and invention. And that's what is the vitality of the city. And that's what brings people like Gatsby to New York, uptown, downtown. The whole city is orbiting around this incredible vitality and the mixing of cultures and migration of Black people from all points, from the South, the Midwest, from the Caribbean, from African countries are coming to New York and creating culture and create tension, which of course creates culture, and that's what's exciting, the thrill of that. And that's what I love about the 2013 version is that it really delivers that to you and says, this is really what a Gatsby figure was searching. What he was looking for to escape was, yes, the plow and the farm, Elton John in the song, he's escaping that. And what does he find in New York? It's the same thing that Carl Van Vechten, who's my guy, as you know, what he found in New York is blackness. I mean, let's call it out, say it out loud. He found this vitality of jazz and dance and innovation and people really remaking themselves. So where a Jay Gatsby is running from the things that shamed him, his ethnicity, Black people are bringing that with them and reimagining it, repackaging it and entering into uneasy negotiations, with white consumer culture, but still insisting on the integrity, of these forms and bringing them to the city. And so that's what the music felt to me so important. And I thought, I love the 1974 version. I thought it was beautiful. And, I love Mia Farrow. I thought she just is so, it was the same Mia Farrow I loved in this as I loved in Rosemary's Baby. Nobody delivers the horrified face, than Mia Farrow. I mean, she really delivered it. Although I loved Carey Mulligan.
Yeah.
And it felt like a perfect, answer in some ways to Mia Farrow's Daisy. I thought because I love the roles she picks. She always picks these very rich feminist roles. And so as soon as I saw her, I didn't know she was in the 2003. I thought, okay, I trust her. I know she's going to bring some layers to this. But, in fact, that's what is the liberation. Let's face it, everybody from Sigmund Freud and Picasso are, it's negritude, if you will. It's blackness. It's primitivism that is making white people feel that maybe I've been barking up the wrong tree. Maybe I'm listening to the wrong music. And maybe there's something else for me. So it's such an important element that really is relegated to the far margins in both Fitzgerald's novel and the 1974 version, but it's given to us right away in the 2013 adaptation.
Yeah. It was fascinating to me looking at 1974 version again, the absence of Black people until the very end. And at the same time, it was, Black music was there, Black dance was there, even Black styling when you think about it.
Neighbors in the window.
Yeah, it was just, it was like, oh my God, how could they do this and not have even Black members in the band and there weren't even Black staff in either of the houses, not even domestic.
I noticed that too.
Which is really wild.
Like my life in Vermont. Often my life in Vermont, I'm like, give me a Black person, a Black person working construction, anyone. I was looking for anyone. But it was interesting in the 74 version. It's, why do Black people always have to be the kind of, they carry the morality.
Yeah. The witnesses.
Oh yeah.
The witnesses.
Yeah.
And
they're so nicely dressed.
And I think
what's
important, I thought, was Caribbean.
That's interesting. Yeah. You felt, yes. Well, that makes sense.
That was my interpretation based on the tone of his voice.
Yes, exactly. And then even their speech, because they speak, conventional English, and it's the white characters and their speech that's sort of deviant, even in the 74 version, even though they are, whatever reason, too timid to introduce, there must have been, Black people serving drinks, this kind of thing. And again, I felt like an important, I wouldn't say correction, but I loved the way that the 2013 version brought it to us right away and said, come on, this is where they're going. This is what they want to see. This is what they want to experience, and this is why Carl Van Vechten took people to Harlem in the same era, because this is what they wanted.
Yeah.
What was missing from their own lives.
Now, maybe perhaps in the 1974 version, Jay Gatsby wanted to mirror Tom Buchanan's world, but on a grander scale.
Yeah.
Which means it was segregated and exclusive.
That's right. Absolutely right. Exactly. I thought even the 2013 version, I like the fact that it also pronounced the anti-Semitism, that animates the novel. It really made that plain. I thought we liked that a lot. And you're right. That's what Tom wanted. Of course, that's what Nick, when he's sort of lost as well and figured as a kind of sexually mysterious character, and everyone wants to pass as Tom. And, it's like, Malcolm X said, the way to become an American is to adopt American racism. That's the quickest way to distinguish yourself from those on the bottom of the totem pole. And if you have something to hide from, of course you're going to make sure you don't have any association with black. So it did make sense. I hear you. That made sense according to the logic of that world.
And it was even interesting that in terms of what was presented as a very white world, there were distinctions within it as well. So Tom Buchanan, he's on the East, which is very interesting to me because in so many places, North, South, East, West do indicate where you are economically and socially.
Like west of the park.
Or east of the park or whatever. So in the Long Island community where Daisy, Tom, and Gatsby live, the East egg is the old money. And the West egg, where Gatsby lives, is the new money. And they are separated by a body of water. And as you were saying earlier, there's this illusion of anybody can make it. You can, reject your past, escape it, etc. But not so much, it seems, certainly not for Tom Buchanan. So what was Fitzgerald revealing about American social class distinctions and that kind of contradiction to the so-called American dream?
I think that's, it's a funny thing about this culture. We pretend we don't have, that there are no class barriers, that they're not permanent, that, anyone can win the lottery and become, I don't know, the next, and we see specific instances of this every day. Someone who, the whole Willy Wonka, I think everyone thinks they're going to get the golden ticket. And, I had a friend who said to me very wisely once in college, this brilliant black woman who said, that's why there'll never be a revolution in this country, because everyone thinks they're going to win the lottery and they'll become the master, the master class. And so it really is about power, not really about equality or democracy at all. It always stick with me, all these years later. She said that. It was very, very intriguing. And I think that's what the book is really revealing. If Gatsby wanted to fully pass, he had money. I hear it opens doors. I hear it enables reinvention. Why does he have to go back in the past to pick, the great white hope, his, kind of, the kind of, damsel in distress, this flower of American, she's little Eva or something, or the figure of the nation,
basically.
A Southern belle, literally, back to, birth of a nation, why is he going back? Why can't he find someone else and create something else? He has the money in the world, apparently, or access to it. He has access to power and, so maybe that's the Achilles heel. Maybe that is the problem, is that, we are, ambivalent at the very least about the past. So the possibility is limited by the imagination. So if you are someone who says, yes, I want to reinvent myself, but I really must have this thing. I really must correct this error in my life where I was denied the love of the great white beauty. Well, then that locks you in the past.
Yeah.
That's not a forward thinking, that's not about self reinvention. That's just about making good on what you feel was owed you. So I think, Gatsby would have been better off if you forgot about Daisy. Jordan's cute and she's really interesting.
Yeah.
And she can make a choice. She's a golf pro. I mean, we can really make something new if we, but what our desires then, what are they born of? Are they eternal and ahistorical? Then yes, that's why, one always longs for the, Lillian Gish, I guess, from Birth of a Nation, right? If that's still the ideal, then you have a lot attached to that ideal. And then that locks you in place, if I'm making any sense.
Well, actually, when I think about Daisy, because she's always been a thorn in my side in this book, she makes everyone believe you have a chance with me. If you notice that?
Yeah.
There's a power in that.
Well, she's like the prom queen. It's like, in a way, she also has not grown past 17 when she was the belle of the ball and all of her beaux.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to dance with her, get on her dance card,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
I know.
And I told Taquina I would love to see the story of her at 45.
That'd be very interesting. It'd be very sad, I'm sure. I mean, she reminds, I think about have you ever seen Rummy and Michelle's high school reunion? I mean, you're right. She's that one, she's that one. But, I want to slap her in the face. I mean, it's so interesting. I remember very well reading the book and having no attachment to her, feeling repulsed by her.
Yes.
Feeling almost afraid of, I knew I had, I grew up in, the Central South, and there are plenty of belles of the ball who I'm sure saw themselves in Daisy Buchanan. And I was just like nauseated by this and knew I had to get the hell out of this place. But it scares me that this is still, and her kind of aggressive empty-headedness, and frankly, as a mother, I'm kind of repulsed by her, this kind of mother who has no attachment to her child at all. I mean, if anything, my kids are my kind of North Star, when in doubt, what do they need? What do they need from me as a mother? It doesn't mean I have to deny myself as a writer or a teacher or a scholar, but, certainly I'm a mother for a reason, but even her child is an appendage. And I'm sure she was treated that way, right? In the world, in both this book, we talk about passing. Children are ornaments or obstacles, and so in some ways, I think I like the way that it questions whether motherhood is natural, because, there's nothing, when she pets her child, it is, you look just like me, anything like your father. The child doesn't exist for her except as, she's also has these narcissistic tendencies too. She's entirely useless. I think about the Stones, Mother's Little Helper. I mean, she'd be on her Valium, in generations to come. We know what happens to this figure. I don't find anything, remarkable about her in any way. And I think she's entirely useless, but in some ways she's the anchor. I mean, she's the problem because yes, I mean, that it doesn't age well, that kind of fragile uselessness does not age well. And, everything in me thrums to the mystery of the Jordan character, while of course Daisy has central stage. What does it mean that everyone is sort of longing for this character, when she has nothing to offer, except, as you say, it's kind of innuendo, the sexual innuendo, but it's perverse because it's so childlike. She's not an adult. It doesn't feel like she's an adult woman. And I think about her vis-a-vis Claire Kendry, who's also very sexual, but is somehow in control of it, understands, yes, this is why I'm desired. This is why, people want to be around me, because I had this kind of sexual power, but she sort of harnesses it. She reminds me more of a Kim Kardashian kind of figure, it's like, well, this is what the culture has thrown at me, so I'm going to try to see how I utilize it and make a business and make something meaningful. I think Claire and Kim would get along. But Daisy is sort of this limp character, this all, she's just muddled in her head and easy to manipulate. I thought about this is the woman who, was the wife of the slaveholder. Remember Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl. This is Mrs. Flint.
Whoa.
This is Mrs. Flint. That's what I say. I say it with my whole face. She is Mrs. Flint because she's easy to manipulate. She's she's just being buffeted about by male desire. She has no real desires, for herself except, I don't know, to disappear, I guess. What does this character want? We don't know what she wants. I feel in some ways she's safest at the end or after she murders, her husband's lover because she has an identity finally. And she has a purpose, which is to keep this secret. Otherwise, she has no purpose. She's just fluff, and there's nothing to her. She's a perfect kind of victim. And I don't have any sympathy for her. I have to say that. I'm sorry. That makes me sound so mean, but I don't.
No, you don't have to be sorry.
You're in the right room for that one.
You're with friends. And just that's Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which is a slave narrative.
Yes, exactly. Actually, she reminds me, this I'm going to go even further. There's a wonderful, a moment in a Dave Chappelle routine where he castigates, white women. And he says, you were in on the heist, but you don't like your cut. And I thought it was just really perfect, just thinking, I saw a lot of collusion here, actually. Her wry remarks don't cut it for me. You married that man. You agree with him with your whole body. You had a baby with him. So your wry kind of, critiques, and making sarcastic remarks about how he's, he's fond of the Nordic race. Honey, you look the other way. I don't believe you. Your little sotto voce critiques are useless in this revolution that's happening. Not to say that this character couldn't evolve or change, but you know what I'm saying? I don't know. As a grown woman, I have no patience for the kind of subtle head shaking cluck, cluck, cluck. I married a racist. Isn't it awful? No, you did that. You go down with him. So I as I grow older, I have less patience because women do have choices. And, this character, as beautifully articulated as she has been by both Carey Mulligan and, Mia Farrow, she wants us to believe that she's a victim, but she's not a victim. She made a choice.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Visit our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. Share this podcast. Join our historical drama community by signing up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content.
Now, back to our podcast conversation.
Well, one thing we tend to do, we talk a lot about the Buchanans and Jay Gatsby and Nick and Jordan. We kind of forget about the Wilsons. And that's the people who live in the middle in the Ashlands or Queens. Yeah. That's John and Myrtle Wilson, and Myrtle is Tom Buchanan's mistress. When talking about The Great Gatsby and how it depicts class, how do John and Myrtle serve the needs of the privileged, or should I say even serve the needs of the story?
Yeah, absolutely. I was so interested in the way the Wilsons were depicted in the 1974 version and the 2013 version. First of all, I was so thrilled to see Herschel from The Walking Dead. He plays Mr. Wilson. Herschel. I loved him. I think if any character that I identified with, and I'd love to know who you two ladies secretly identified with, I would say if Mr. Wilson in the 1974 version. I thought it was interesting, kind of the way that film captured the kind of moral reversal, where, the God-fearing character is portrayed as this naive who is this kind of idiot who's being cuckolded, but he has a belief in God, but he's a fool. And the Sodom and Gomorrah of the parties at Gatsby's house are like paradise, but, and it's not just even the consumerism, but the waste in the 74, it's not just that you're, drinking a lot. It's just you're breaking glasses too.
Yeah.
Who's going to clean that up? Who's going to clean that up? Right? Right. I'm waiting for a word. Come on, butterfly, let's see you. We know who's really going to clean up this mess. Mm-hmm. And the aggressive waste, when you kind of want these characters to get what's coming to them. And here are the Wilsons, who are, Mr. Wilson, anyway, I thought, again, played with such quiet dignity in the 74 version. I thought Mr. Wilson, and even Mrs. Wilson, Myrtle, is grotesque as she was. She almost a Fellini character with that makeup. Yeah. But there's something tragic about her, and then in the I love Isla Fisher. I thought she was wonderful in that. And I thought when she came in the party, when we see her, she's dressed like Carmen Jones, even the fake fruit in her hair and the red dress and signifier. I love the way the movie was so interesting.
Now we talk about
references.
2013 or 1974?
2013.
Okay.
In the 2013 version, when we had the house party, it's lit up in Technicolor and there's music and it's hip hop music and there's Isla Fisher as Mrs. Wilson. At first I thought when they came on, so I thought that, Mr. Wilson in 74, I felt his dignity. I felt that this man, was a true victim actually in the book, and as his dignity gets eroded. And I actually felt for his disgraced masculinity in a way I didn't care about, Tom, at all, but I felt Wilson's deeply. And I thought about the weird way in which the movie and the film, the movie and the book, it's like, what if we read it as a passion play? Then who's the Jesus character? I think the book wants us to think it's Gatsby, but I think it's really Mr. Wilson. I mean, he's been suffering throughout this whole thing, and he's the one who brings people to justice. Justice they would not find, as we know. I guess he's not going to go to jail. He's not going to go to jail. He runs a jail. As that was portrayed really, kind of this kind of comic exaggeration in the modern version with Leo DiCaprio, but he visits this and then, it's like he's trying to right this wrong, and it's wrong what's been done to him. It's wrong what's been done to him. Not only forget, the wife, but it's just the way that Tom Buchanan keeps him, stringing along with this promise of this car. And we all know the car is in exchange for what he's doing. And he still won't make good on that exchange, so the book is, of course, always about it's about capitalism. So every relationship is transactional in some way. But Mr. Wilson, I think, still believes in right and wrong. That moment in the 74 version when Myrtle is mocking him and he says, I still believe in right and wrong. And I thought he's the only character in this book that really does. Yeah. And he's portrayed as this goof, this fool, but he's the one, and he can't survive, And I loved in the 2013 version when he has a gas station in the middle of all of this dig, and he's sick from it. And you think, yes, this character he's the one who suffers. In Vermont, in Burlington, we have a huge crisis around, when who lives near the airport, who has to bear that constant noise and who doesn't. And that gets revived with every school budget, every time it's reintroduced, these class divisions get worked out again. And I see it happening in my small community, and you see it happening then here. He's trying to hold on to this little thing that he has. He's a kind of true American subject, right? If there's Gatsby who comes I had an accidental, I made $1 million, just by, this. And then you have a Wilson who's working every day, honestly, at a business. He helps people, he gives them gas so they can drive their expensive cars, and he still can't make it even. He's presumably good to his wife, at least in the 74 version. He's not violent. He is in the 2013 version, and he can't get a break. And I thought it was interesting in the 2013 version when at first I was a little repulsed by the way they were being figured. I thought, why do they have to be the goofs? You know, why do they have, but then I think the film really recovers from that and shows us how they are victimized, you know, by this larger industrialization that is going to leave them behind, and that will leave the Nick Carraways and the Tom Buchanans and the Jay Gatsby's just richer, but it will just take and take and take from him. And there's nothing he can do about it. Even the man who is stripping his wife won't even, you know, out of, you know, some kind of mercy, help him just leave. That's all he wants to do is just leave. You know, he can't make it here. He's a real victim in the book, I think. Yeah. And in the 1974 version and the 2013 version, nobody really, I think, is a victim, which I love about that. I think only an Australian looking at our culture, like Succession, only outsiders looking at us and see all the dirt we do can really give it to us and show us who we are. And so in that way, there are no heroes, no victims in the 2013 version. But, you know, I really do feel the 1974 version still maintains a sense of empathy and understanding. But in even the Wilson character, I think he's given some dignity. It's poor Myrtle is the garish painted lady and sacrificed, you know, on the altar of the world all these men are creating. But I think Mr. Wilson, you know, is a much more interesting character in the 74 film. And just his shop, what happens to his shop in the 2013 version, I think symbolizes what's happening to this man. In fact, that he's sick because he's ingesting chemicals every day, you know, and everyone can see it. But in the illusion, in this world that Gatsby has created, or Tom has created, where only they matter, only their desires matter, it's ignored. You know, Wilson would never dare to bring his problems to a man like, he knows Tom doesn't care about him as a person, but we see him. It made me think about the film version of Passing. And I thought that the actor who played Irene did a brilliant job of embodying her bourgeois ennui, the kind of malaise that, you know, the problem that had no name, you know, she really, I thought, I actually never considered that when I thought about Irene and what troubled Irene. But I thought the same forces that have made Irene, you know, she's like a figure of consumption, you know, when she's going to be fainting on her, you know, in the film in Passing. I thought it was beautifully done with Wilson. He was just driven mad by modernity.
Yeah. And that's Tessa Thompson, you know, as Irene.
Tessa Thompson. Yeah. She's brilliant. Brilliant.
Wow, Emily, as you're talking, what's also emerging for me, because in a way, in Passing and in The Great Gatsby, there are deceptions going on about identity, hiding. We talked about the hats in Passing as a way also of people kind of hiding. But even Mr. Wilson, his wife accuses him of deceiving her. He had a borrowed suit for their wedding. She thought he was much more successful. He, you know, gave this appearance. And it makes me wonder about a society that makes people feel we always have to in some way be performing that we're better, usually economically, or better off than we actually are. That just struck me as you were talking about what was going on with the Wilsons versus the world of the Buchanans and the Gatsbys and the Carraways. That everybody.
Absolutely. You know, it reminds me of, I wish I remember the year, but Langston Hughes wrote a story. I'm sorry, I'll remember it after we, of course, sign off. But it was a story, it always struck me. And it's a story about passing. Who's Passing for Who is the name of the story. And it was in, I think, you know, wasn't in The Ways of White Folks. So it was another collection of stories, I believe. And in the story, he has this great line where you have these Black characters who, it's sort of late It's in the 30s. So sort of after the first, shine and hope and promise of the jazz age and the new Negro movement. There's a lot of cynicism that has now, people have sort of descended. People are living this more cynically now. They understand, again, it's a transaction. It's not a revolution, it's a transaction. And so you have white people coming to Harlem and Black artists, intellectuals, writers who are willing to accommodate their curiosity, their kind of subtle racism, because there's something in it for them. Either it makes them feel glamorous, or actually it might lead to some influx of, I'll have a little more capital to write my book or to make my play. So there's an understanding. It's sort of the shine is off the bloom is off the rose, but we understand what's going on now. And there's a great line that it struck me, years ago. So the white characters come to Harlem with the Black kind of artist, and they're being shown around, and then they confess that they are actually Black. And they are also from the Midwest, right? It's this unknowable place of cacti and tumbleweeds, this place, we don't even know what it is. And the Black characters are convinced, they accept immediately that the white characters are actually Black. And so the narrator says, we relaxed and we became natural. And I thought about how oxymoronic that phrase is. What does it mean to become natural? Like, what has to be taken away so that you are natural? And to what degree is acting natural? How does one act natural? Isn't that oxymoronic? If acting is performance, then isn't that the antithesis of being natural? So what is natural? And now in our culture, we're so obsessed, of course, by surfaces and screens. And I was reading this great commentary on The Great Gatsby, and how, we have this moment of a shift in our culture when the icon becomes the hero. Just the kind of symbol becomes, we project onto the symbol, the image, real things like morality and decency. All we have is an image, and Jay Gatsby, like the eyes in the book, it's just a billboard, but we project meaning onto these symbols. And I think that's something that's really fascinating about this moment in our culture. And so what does it mean even now to be natural? When, thinking about social media and how so many of us have become part of our daily lives, part of our intimate lives, but yet it's performance and it's screens and it's filters and this and that for some and not for others. So, I think leans to this. What does it mean to be natural in this culture? When, at a moment in time in the 20s, I was always fascinated to learn this in grad school, that it's a moment when women start shaving their legs, and not because they decide they're going to shave their legs. It becomes part of a campaign. I think I read something about, some manufacturer of razors. There were too many so they had to convince women that their body hair was repugnant. That really is just all a campaign, just the way that we're all manipulated into thinking February 14th means that we should express our love on that day. That's just Hallmark making money off of us. So, we attach ourselves to these campaigns. We decide we're complicit, right? In this, and we decide that they have meaning for us. We sign on to it. You don't have to do anything on February 14th. It's just a day, but you decide it's a day of love and this kind of thing. And then you kind of get mad at your boyfriend because he doesn't bring you flowers on that day, but that's just Hallmark telling you that it's a specific day where he has to demonstrate his love. So we know what artifice looks like, but do we know what it means to be natural anymore? And I'm just as guilty as anyone else. What would it mean for us to be natural? Are we all in situations all the time where we can't use certain language? We can't do this and that. I'm not going to wear this and that because I need to project this because it might get me further along here and there. So then what do we have? Let's admit, as a culture, do we even value authenticity anymore? Authenticity is another kind of commodity. I think about someone like Jennifer Lawrence. I don't know how people feel about her these days, but I know when people loved her, it was because she was kind of a goofball and she would seem like Hollywood, but isn't that just another kind of grift? And no shade on her. I mean, it's a very smart grift. It's a very smart grift in a culture where everyone's so interested in being polished all the time. I mean, look at right now, this new, I think about Taylor Swift is thinking about Daisy Buchanan, but she's now being dragged about these pictures. Who knows what happened? We weren't there. We don't know what actually happened between Celine Dion, who hugged who and what it meant and who felt what and who was just hungry and who was, just a little nervous. I mean, we can't even allow these people any humanity anymore. Even, it's all about what they appear to be. So what good is it even to be authentic? Because they're just going to drag you anyway. So, you understand in some ways why some celebrities have no social media presence because it's not a game you can win. The higher up you go, the more they're going to tear you down. I think about Lizzo when everything was happening. Lizzo, I would saw it happening. I said to my phone, Lizzo, just write it out. Just write it out, Lizzo. This was always coming for you. Don't feel you were being especially, now run over the rails. This happens to everyone. They look for it. What is it in our culture? We have such an obsession with elevating people and then immediately bringing them in. We take this terrible, perverse pleasure and defrocking.
That happens
our celebrities.
With Jay Gatsby. Tom is
exactly
that person gunning for him.
Exactly. But we all have our skeletons. My daughter, let me say, my daughter Julia, she said to me, she goes, people, she said, her friend, she goes, people love you. I said, but the real me, right? And, it drives her crazy. I saw Bruce Springsteen. I heard him on Terry Gross and he was saying, Terry Gross was saying, well, your kid must be so happy for you. There's some big concert. He said, and I knew he was a real dad. And he said this, he said, no child wants to see their parent applauded by 60,000 people. Now they'd like to see their parent humiliated by 60,000 people. But he's a real dad because the celebrity doesn't exist inside the home when our family can see, I was just yelling at my daughter before we got on because the dog is going crazy and, but I'm not going to bring that energy here. So, but that's me too.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about that. And so the book does send up, the way that we are living so much on the surface. But I think in this moment in time, there is no advantage to being authentic. I think about Alec Baldwin. Alec Baldwin thought that if he told the truth, that would serve him. Wrong move, Mr. Baldwin. And so that's the thing though, but I like him a lot. And I was, I saw that happening and thought, he's a decent person. He thought, I'm just going to tell the truth about what happened. I did something. It was an accident. But lawyer up, dude, because this is not a culture that respects the truth and respects vulnerability and honesty. You have to have a story. You have to have an angle,
a brand,
or you have to have a brand, it's otherwise people will destroy you and take pleasure from it and then move on in the next news cycle and then forget you. So, it's a cynical moment, I think, to be alive. And we're seeing, I think, the ascent of that, in the world that Fitzgerald has created. I think, like Andy Warhol saw all be famous for 15 minutes. Fitzgerald also saw something too about how dangerous it is to live a life that is full of pretension, but how inevitable it is in American culture.
Wow.
Speaking of American culture, one thing I honed in on while watching the movie, the 1974 version most recently, was the music. That was used, and some of it authentic 1920s music. And then I was listening to some of the lyrics. Now, of course, we made a note about where were the Black musicians when Duke Ellington was in New York in 1925.
Among others, yeah.
Among others. So you see people dancing to James P. Johnson's The Charleston, Black composer. So, okay, just want to make note of that. One of the songs that really stuck out for me was at the very end, and it's Ain't We Got Fun, which was published in 1921. And I used to think, oh, that's just a, cute little song for the 1920s. But once you start listening to the lyrics, it takes on new meaning. And I think it kind of hones into what you just said. The rent's unpaid, dear. We haven't a car, but in any way, dear, we'll stay as we are. Even if we owe the grocer, don't we have fun tax collectors getting closer, still we have fun. There's nothing surer. The rich get rich and the poor get poorer. In the meantime, in between time, ain't we got fun? What has changed? What was happening in the 1920s that made these composers go there?
Well, it makes me think about Farrell. Remember the song, "Don't Worry, Be Happy"? No, that was not. Sorry,
Yeah.
"Happy" is Farrell Williams.
Happy, yeah.
But "Don't Worry, Be Happy" was Bobby McFerrin
Yeah.
earlier, and how that like what Republican used it as their campaign song? Was it Bush or someone?
I think it was.
And I thought about I remember thinking that, the ironies of that, and who that song is. Are you trying to hypnotize people and tell them, like, don't worry about the injustice around you, just be happy, just smile, look cute. I read it, somewhat cynically. I mean, as we know, like you said, in the 30s, the Harlem Renaissance, it didn't raise anybody's wages in the end. It still didn't keep people, the jazz age didn't keep people from jumping out of windows, when they lost their fortunes in the crash in 1929. I mean, yeah, it feels to me very cynical in a way, and but also true to a certain experience. It reminds me of, I remember actually the expression "free, white, and 21." I read in a Black author novel. I think it was Jessie Fawcett's novel Plum Bun, which I love. Written in, I want to say 28, 29, and the character's passing, a Black woman passing, a biracial. No, she's Black, passing for white to go to Cooper Union and to have a career as an artist. And that term comes up, and I thought it was, I love the irony of it. I love the irony of it. I thought a Black person was to coin this term, free, white, and 21. But there's something about it. And then to be free, white, and 21, on whose shoulders? What's being erased? Who's holding it up? It reminds me of Monticello. Gone there, and the whole place is structured so that Jefferson never had to see his slaves. He never had to see us, serving the food. He could just live his white life and pretend there were just pairs of little fairies who were bringing him things, and the dumb waiters and everything. There's a whole, like, a subterranean system where the people did work, where Black people did work, but he didn't have to see it. So free, we got fun at what expense, at whose cost? Someone is making sure that someone is cleaning out the broken glass. Someone is, rebuffing the floors when you do the Charleston on them in your shoes and pull up the rugs. Someone is beautifying and sanitizing the space so that you can continue in this illusion that it's just one big champagne party. But, we know that for most people, life is still happening. And so I love how these songs become anthems, but they also become, oh my God, I think it's something like a Nuremberg rally, where certain music is played and signals a certain kind of response. It's sort of, this is the ruling class. This is what we believe. And this is what we insist on, that life is fun and joyful. And that's what it is. And if you don't agree, there's something wrong with you. And so you keep, like Mr. Wilson, you keep quiet. The fact that you're being crushed by these, machines around you that have already determined the fact, your uselessness, if you will, in this larger cultural highway. You're just off on the side. So it's, who's having fun, and what does it mean to have the fun, to possess it, at whose cost? I mean, I think that's what the book really, it's about power, it's not about fun. Someone is being crushed. Someone's dream is being denied so that yours can flourish. And, you cannot win unless others lose. And that, I think, is the lesson of capitalism, and again, I'm just as deeply implicated in this game as anyone else. But every so often you see something like this book and both of these films that make it clear to us what we have actually bought into and what it costs others.
Yeah. Well, talking with you, Emily, and some of the things you brought up, I now have even another scene that comes up for me in the 1974 film. And I now see many things that I was looking at in one way with even a broader sense of, I mean, Daisy wears white. That's the costuming Theone Aldridge decided to make kind of like her color. And when Gatsby does the tea at Nick Carraway's cottage, there are all these white flowers. I mean, it was like all of a sudden, what's coming up for me is I'm seeing all the whiteness that's in
I know.
the 1974 version.
I was so oppressed by those white flowers. See all the whiteness. Oh my God. Get me out.
And
Get me out of this place.
And it was almost like, without saying anything about race, they were saying a lot about race.
Yes. They made all that whiteness so sinister. And maybe not for every viewer, but for certain of us. We thought of some other whiteness, like some white hoods and stuff. And, and it was just like, yeah, but it was like that deceptive quality. But then you, for some of us, it was triggering of other kinds of whiteness.
Yeah, it's like the image is pristine, but underneath there is definitely something very sinister and hollow.
I mean, if people connecting that eugenics conversation that they're having with this,
exactly,
what do you see? Hoods.
Yeah, exactly. What's so interesting? I love the Lothrop Stoddard. I'd actually forgotten about that in the Great Gatsby. I loved watching the things that survived from the book in both films. Mm-hmm. In both adaptations, the lines so Stoddard, was obviously important. But that DuBois had a debate with him?
Really?
Yes, he did. DuBois debated with him. I'm going to tell you exactly when, ladies. He had a debate with him in March 1929. The Chicago Forum Council advertised, and I quote, "one of the greatest debates ever held." And the topic was, shall the Negro be encouraged to seek cultural equality? In smaller letters, has a Negro the same intellectual possibilities as other races? And the answer, yes, was a picture of DuBois. And the answer, no, it's a picture of Lothrop Stoddard. Mm. And so according to, one great New Yorker writer, I was reading his piece about it, DuBois trounced Stoddard, which I love to read. And, that I love that perspective. And DuBois wrote home to, he wrote home that it had gone well. It was a great occasion. And he certainly felt he had held his own. But, Black people were reading this book. And I actually learned about Stoddard's novel in, I think, one of DuBois's novels, or in Plum Bun, again, Jessie Fawcett's novel, because Black people were reading this too. And of course, in all the Black newspapers, they, handed him his hat and called him an embarrassment and, ridiculous. The high priest of racial baloney was what I think he was called in the Baltimore Afro-American. But, everyone was so aware of this figure. And I thought about books today and, like Dinesh D'Souza or someone, or The Bell Curve or something that captures, a certain kind of American imagination. But Stoddard was of that moment. People were reading this and wondering how Black intellectuals, how do we combat this? And white people were wondering, is it true? And I think I thought about, right now what's happening around the country and Black intellectuals being, really, there's a witch hunt right now, in the same way. And so it's sort of these books emerge that really don't have much merit. They won't last. No one's going to remark upon them as great works of, they contributed a lot, but they captured fear, a certain kind of fear and anxiety. And that's why of course, they appealed so much. Why Tom can't stop talking about it in the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this is going to be our final question, and it's just brings the book to its final ending. Spoiler alert to people who have not seen the movie or have not read the book. You may want to stop listening at this point, but I think we all know how this comes to a conclusion in The Great Gatsby. There are only two people at Gatsby's funeral, Nick and his father. Why do you think Fitzgerald ends the story this way, where a man of great popularity or celebrity, yet mysterious, where you had hundreds of people attending his parties? Why is he forgotten? Why is there no one else there?
I'm going to make a very strange segue, but you two know me well enough to see me through this. But it reminds me of Mike Tyson. At some point in an interview, Mike Tyson, I think what Avery was saying, you lost everything, you lost all the trophies, you lost the money. He said, good. Because then I found out who my friends really were.
Mm.
And he said, when he was at his height and he was famous and he was world champion, it was very confusing. Sycophants, fans, everything he wanted. And he was glad. And I so understood that. And I have another friend who says, you only need 6 friends in life, 6 pallbearers at your funeral. And I thought about in Mouse, Art Spiegelman's Mouse. And at some point, the son comes home and says, these friends were mean to me at school. And the father who, survived the Holocaust in this graphic, depiction says, friends, wait until basically, I'm wildly paraphrasing and I won't capture the potency of that moment, but, wait until they come to round you up and see who your real friends are. And so I thought it was really poignant. I thought it was quite poignant. Nobody knew this man, James Gatz. By the end of the movie and the book, we have Nick proclaiming the two of them to be have been close friends. They weren't. He didn't know him any better than anyone else. He knew one version of him. And Nick, I love what you're saying about writing because, another thing I really enjoyed about the 2013 version is how they really foregrounded, Nick was a writer, and this was what it was really about. But Nick is another parasite. I mean, writers are. I mean, I'm going to be the first to say in some way, we're always looking for a story, it's like, don't trust us. I mean, we're kind of always looking for the story in something. And you're just the character in the stories we're always writing. So even that felt to me insincere, I mean, but the tragedy of Gatsby is no greater than the tragedy of all of the people in Potter's Field, bodies never claimed, people who died without their loved one. I mean, it is an American story in some ways, his ending. I mean, who gets that, that funeral that we love to watch the fall, the people who we celebrate, I think of the wonderful military funerals where they actually celebrate your anonymity. You were just a soldier, but in that way you were glorious, you were honorable, but you were just a soldier, the kind of uniformity of those grades. I think it's really beautiful, actually. And in the same way, Gatsby was just a person.
And he was a soldier at one time.
And he was a soldier, you're right. He was a soldier. Didn't even get that honor at the end. But his father, though, remembered him. And so I thought, okay, you can have a celebrity's funeral and people come and gawk and see who else is there and take selfies with the other famous people who are there. But his father loved and forgave him. And Nick, he was a writer, but he also, I will say, loved him in a way, loved who he believed Gatsby to be. But in the end, who was this person? He was a martyr. I think the film, almost in the book, I think was still as a martyr to his love for this white lady. I mean, I don't really see, as I said, I see Mr. Wilson as much more of a tragic figure in the book. I think that, narcissists die alone. And, because Gatsby was he a victim or was he a perpetrator? I mean, he wanted to keep Daisy imprisoned in a perpetual present. He wanted to deny her whole past and say she only loved him. I mean, Gatsby was deeply flawed as well. He wanted things and he didn't get them. And that's America, baby. That's what it means to live in this country. And so it was fitting in its pathos, I thought, the ending. I thought it was fitting, that he died as he lived, which was a creature of other people's imagination and loved by a very hungry father at the end, who himself created a story about how his son really, and it's, I was moved that his son took care of him financially. That was important to me, as a person who is embedded in communities and thinks about ancestors and people, who enabled me to come to be able to sit with you two and have this afternoon, and who, I got elders, whatever. So I love the fact that he looked after his father, but he was a creature of lies and masks and unknown. And that's the way he lived, he died the way he lived. And that's what he wanted. He didn't want to be known. That was on him. So although I thought I certainly saw, the brilliance of that ending, it felt right to me. But I think, at a different moment, I might have felt more emotional. But I have to say, because we talked about putting this conversation with passing, I felt defensive because I thought, who mourned Claire? Who mourned Claire? Who came to claim the body?
Yeah. Wow.
I thought, and thinking about who was Claire in the book, and thinking about Daisy's motoring off with her husband and their little roadster and living their lives, and yeah, Daisy's going to take a bunch of Valium and, who knows what's going to happen to her. I mean, she's going to live that life that she herself set herself up for, which her mother set her on the road for. And her poor daughter maybe will become a feminist and stop shaving her legs and become, maybe Pammy's going to have a real life. But, in some ways I think about Claire, it was in the pantheon, as a really, to me, I thought, well, this is a tragic figure, because who claimed her, who knew her? Mr. Wilson had every right to shoot Gatsby. He had every right. I don't fault the man for that. But,
And he shoots,
and I think
he shoots himself too.
He shoots himself. And I think, Gatsby, he probably would have loved this death as a martyr to his love. But the love itself was suffocating. The love itself was based on artifice. I mean, who is this girl that you've been dreaming about for all these years and keeping obsessive stalkery trappings of? I mean, she's just a person like anybody else. And she also is kind of terrible. She's not strong. She's not Jordan, Yeah. She's a little daisy, a little limp flower that really gets, a strong wind, and she's done. So I didn't feel that. I thought, well, he actually magnifies, and she'll probably drink herself to death thinking about, what she did to poor Gatsby. And that's the story that she bought into as well. So it felt like everybody got their proper end in a way in that book, but it made me miss Claire. It made me think, yes, Claire deserved a real funeral.
Yeah.
She deserved somebody to come back from her past and tell us, no, she was a good person and she did these things and did that thing. At least Gatsby had that. At least his father came back and testified to his goodness and to his authenticity. And that's a lot more than many of us get.
Yeah, we didn't get that in Nella Larsen's novel. We didn't get a funeral.
Yeah.
We did.
Well, wow, this is a somber note to end this conversation on.
But it's a pretty somber novel, too.
Yes,
true.
but also we can see how it sparks more ideas for sequels. And The Great Gatsby is now in public domain, so I'm sure we will see many more adaptations and interpretations. And, just this conversation alone shows the enduring value of that novel. Ask your daughter to give it another chance.
I'm going to. I will. I'll let her listen to this podcast.
Listen to this podcast and give it a chance. So thank you, Emily, for joining us today on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on the 50th anniversary of the 1974 film, The Great Gatsby. So I am going to close this by letting everyone know that you can see the adaptation of F. Scott Fitzgerald's iconic 1925 novel, The Great Gatsby, directed by Jack Clayton and featuring Robert Redford, Mia Farrow, Sam Waterston, Bruce Dern, Lois Childs, Karen Black, and Scott Wilson on streaming services for subscription or fee. Do a search online or check your local library because there may be DVDs still around. Also, since we mentioned the Baz Luhrmann 2013 adaptation, that's also available for streaming as well. So do your search online and you will find The Great Gatsby and other adaptations of the film prior to these two movies. You can purchase the book, The Great Gatsby, and books by Emily Bernard and other titles related to this and past podcasts from our affiliate bookstore. Visit our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters and click on the bookstore link. When you buy a book, you support our podcast production, as we're doing today, and independent booksellers.
We invite you to share this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters with someone you know who would enjoy the conversation. Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters and enjoy past episodes wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. If you listen to the podcast on Apple, please leave a review. If you're listening on Spotify, we hope you'll give us a 5-star rating. Sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content. You can also write us at podcast@michonnebostongroup.com. Like and share Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your social media.
This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast about historical films and series dramas. Visit our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters.
Tell us what historical dramas you're watching. Who knows? We may do a show about it. Sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with the people you know who binge on historical drama.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston. Thank you for listening.